Hey guys, welcome to video 2 of the 12 Principles of Economics. So we're going to pick up with principle number 7. Resources should be used efficiently. Now, just so you know, guys, you're going to hear this term efficient a lot, okay? And it all relates back to the idea of making choices with our scarce resources. Remember that scarcity means that there's a limited supply, so we have to be really careful with our resources. We have to use them in the best way possible. So when an economy's resources are used efficiently, it means they're being used in a way that has fully exploited all the opportunities to make us better off. So we've used them in a way without letting them go to waste. Now, if you're trying to get a good visual for this, I know if you watched the last video, you saw we were just talking about Kroger. Maybe think about the parking lot at Kroger. And I know that the parking lot at Kroger is not this big, but whatever, roll with it. When you see a parking lot, what's the best way to divide up the parking spaces? You know, that space is a limited resource, and we want to use that space in the best way possible. So how should we divide the limited number of spaces in our parking lot? What's the most efficient way to do it? But also, maybe we should think about what's the most equitable way to do it? If you need to, pause the video for a second and think about that. Well, you may have thought about this, and I'm sure you've noticed before that when you get to a crowded parking lot, you spend a lot of time looking for a good spot, and eventually you just settle on that one that's like, 20 yards away. And by the time you get up to the front of the parking lot, maybe you've noticed this, there's like 4 or 5 really good spaces that are totally empty. Well, I'm not talking about somebody who just left. What I'm talking about is the disabled parking spaces. Guys, is it efficient or equitable to save the very best spaces in the parking lot for disabled people? Well, it's equitable, right? It's not efficient because we're letting some of the best resources, i.e. the best spaces, go to waste. Well, that's not a good use of our scarce resources, but we do have another goal in mind, which is making sure that we don't have any disabled people having to wheel themselves 100 yards across a really hot parking lot in Texas. And so, once again, that's not really our business in economics to decide whether it's right or wrong to have handicapped parking spaces, but we can point out that it's not efficient to have handicapped parking spaces. And we can let society make its own decisions from there. I'm not saying that I'm against handicapped parking spaces, just for the record. All right, let's keep it moving. All right, so number 8, markets usually lead to efficiency. Now, you might have heard me talk about this idea of markets before. A market is just a place where there's a voluntary exchange of goods and services between buyers and sellers. That's why we have a supermarket. In other words, it's a market for a bunch of different things like, eggs and cereal and meat and other kinds of home items, right? And so when we say that we have like a market economy, you might have heard people say that before. A market economy is also known as a free enterprise or a capitalist economy. So hopefully these terms are sounding familiar. It's a system where economic decisions are made by individuals who act according to their own self-interest. So a place where you can voluntarily exchange goods and services based on your own self-interest. That's a market economy. And in case you're wondering, that's the kind of economy that you and I live in. Now, in the USA, the reason why we're considered a market economy is because there's no branch of the government that's responsible for ensuring economic efficiency. In other words, we're a laissez-faire economy, one where the government more or less stays out of the way, and they let buyers and sellers freely interact according to their own self-interests. Now, just to give you an idea of why this works so well, markets make specialization possible. And remember, we talked about specialization in the first slideshow, where we were talking about how trade makes us better off. Well, it's not just trade between countries. If you shrink this down to a micro level, trade between individuals also makes our lives better. So think of it this way. In a market economy, some people specialize in becoming surgeons, and other people specialize in becoming airline pilots, like we see here in our 2 pictures. Now, what's beautiful about a market is that the surgeon does not need to know how to fly an airplane, and the pilot doesn't need to know how to do surgery, but they can both get surgery or find a flight relatively easily. This is all possible because there's a market for both flights and for medical procedures in a market economy. So you and I participate in a market economy. In a market economy, people get what they need by getting money. The way we get money is by getting good at one particular thing. Like, just think, you're going to go to college, you're going to major in something. That one thing is going to help you make money, And then you can trade that money for everything else that you need, like a house and food and clothing and a car. You don't need to know how to make a car or fix a car. You don't need to know how to build a house or maintain your house. You don't need to know how to sew clothing or farm, but yet you can still get everything you need by being good at just one thing. That's the idea of specialization, and that's part of the secret sauce that makes markets really efficient. Now, sometimes the government is needed to intervene in a free market to restore society's welfare. Now, when I'm saying society's welfare, I'm not talking about like traditional, like, food stamps kind of welfare. When I say society's welfare, what I'm talking about is the well-being of people in our country. And of course, we know that the government of the United States is supposed to provide for the general welfare of the people. In other words, making sure that we're all okay. Now, every once in a while, there's what's called a market failure. A market failure is when something causes a market to reduce the welfare of society instead of improve it. So just think like, I'm sure in U.S. history you studied about the big monopolies in the late 1800s. Think like the railroad monopoly or the steel monopoly. Those markets became dominated by one producer, and that one producer was taking away a lot of the benefits of a market from the rest of society. And so in that situation, the government was needed to step in to hit the reset button on the economy. So like you see here, I got my old school video game, Mortal Kombat. Okay. The government can do things like enact laws and levy taxes against businesses, especially monopolies. Just think like the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. Hopefully you learned about that, which basically made it illegal to be a monopoly. Those kind of things can, like I said, hit the reset button on the economy and restore society's welfare. They can make things better again. So if you've never seen one of these old video game systems, when the game would freeze up, you had to hit that button right there, the reset button, and that would get the game restarted again. So in some cases, the government is needed to hit the reset button. All right, principle number 10, and this is a big one, guys. One person's spending is another person's income. So I think of the economy and a market economy like a yin-yang, which goes very well with our Kung Fu theme, right? In market economies, like I said, people make money by selling things to other people. So, even if you're somebody who works at Starbucks, you sell your labor to Starbucks, and that's what they're paying you for. Labor is a resource, and so you're selling your resource to get money to buy all the other things you need in society. Remember we said specialization, that's how markets work. So one thing you got to keep in mind is that if someone in the economy spends more money, then somebody else in the economy will make more money. And the opposite is also true. If one person in the economy spends less money, then somebody else's income is going to fall. And so, for example, if we spend more money on education, that means teachers' paychecks go up. I don't know if you can tell, but I like that idea. But if we as a society spend less money on education, then that means that teachers are going to get less income. Now, you might say, okay, well, I hate teachers, so that's fine. But hold on a second. Just remember, teachers go to the grocery store and spend money. So like, let's say if you work at the grocery store, if we take away money from teachers, that means teachers' income goes down. And if teachers' income goes down, what happens to teachers' spending? Well, their spending goes down. That means they don't go to the grocery store where you work. And if enough teachers don't shop there and the revenues of the grocery store goes down, well, can the grocery store still afford to pay for your labor? Maybe not. They might have to cut their spending on labor, which means they might have to let you go. And then you don't have money in your pocket, which means that you can't spend, and on and on and on and on. You can see it's kind of a domino effect. And that's actually going to bring us to our next principle. Spending is sometimes out of line with the economy's productive capacity. Okay? In other words, sometimes the amount of goods and services that people want to buy doesn't match up with the amount of goods and services that the economy is actually able to produce. So just think like if we had a meter on the economy is able to produce at level 5. Maybe sometimes people are spending at level 6, which means people are overspending. They're spending and demanding more than the economy can actually produce. And that leads to some bad effects. In other cases, if the economy is able to produce at a 5, maybe people are only spending at a 3. That means that people aren't buying enough stuff and the economy is overproducing in a way that is going to cause some other kinds of problems. The main kind of problems we worry about are what are called recessions or depressions. Those things can happen if we don't spend enough money. right? When people are buying less than the economy can produce, it leads to something like the Great Depression. But when people buy too much stuff, when they're buying at a 6, but the economy can only produce at a 5, it leads to this other problem called inflation. Inflation means that prices are going to go up. Now this leads us to our very last principle of economics, the 12th principle, drum roll. Brrr. Government policies can change spending. Okay, so just imagine like this is the government here, all these guys on the steps. The government can actually choose to spend more money or spend less money, and that can do certain things to stimulate the economy. It can get the economy back to level 5 if we've been at level 3, right? Or if we're at level 6, it can put us back down to level 5 where we belong. Now, spending more money, if the government does things like build roads or spends more on education, it can stimulate the economy during a recession. So when the economy is underproducing, if the government spends more money, it can boost us up back to a normal level of production. Spending less can reduce inflation. So if we're overbuying stuff, when the government cuts back on spending, that can sort of like slow the economy down back to a normal level of production again. The other thing the government can do is they can raise or lower taxes, right? They say, we've come to collect your taxes. The government can raise taxes if they want to slow the economy down, or they can lower taxes if they want to speed it up. Raising taxes reduces spending, because people don't get to keep as much of their income. And lowering taxes increases spending because people can keep more of their income. So in other words, if the economy is underproducing, we can cut taxes, people spend more, and that gets us back up to level 5. If we're overdoing it and prices are too high, well, we can raise people's taxes, that cuts their spending, and that brings us back down to level 5. And so in other words, we're just saying the government can sort of balance things out when things are off balance. You've made it through your very first set of notes in AP Macroeconomics. I know this was kind of a long one, but if you remember these 12 principles, I promise they will be useful. So your training shall continue tomorrow. That's it for today. Thanks for watching, guys. See you next time.